French Revolution. 14th of July is celebrated in France as Bastille Day. It commemorates the storming of the Bastille and the launch of the French Revolution. Incredibly, even a town like Franschhoek celebrates Bastille Day in South Africa, even though none of the ancestors who came there would have been involved or approved. The French Revolution was one of the most influential events of modern history. The 10-year period from 1789 to 1799, when France went from a monarchy under Louis XVI to a republic, to a reign of terror, to a dictatorship under Napoleon, was one of the most tumultuous times of European history. Much myth and romantic legend has been written on what some politicians would like the French Revolution to have been, but the reality was that the French Revolution was a monstrous horror. In the name of liberty, equality, fraternity, or death, over 40,000 people lost their heads to the guillotine, 300,000 people publicly executed by firing squads, drownings or other means of mass murder, and ultimately many millions died in 25 years of war and upheavals that resulted. The French Revolution has been the inspiration and the model for all socialist and communist revolutions in modern history. Lord Acton, in his lectures on the French Revolution, observed, the appalling thing in the French Revolution is not the tumult, but the design. Most people want to see revolutions as spontaneous, accidental, but in fact, as Lord Acton and others have pointed out, it was all designed. Through all the fire and smoke, we perceive the evidence of calculating organization. The managers remain studiously concealed and masked, but there's no doubt about their presence from the first. Can anyone identify these two characters on the screen? Robespierre on the left and Voltaire on the right. This is Voltaire. Voltaire was the Karl Marx of the French Revolution. He wasn't alive when it happened, but he wrote the theory. He laid down the intellectual, philosophical foundations for the revolution. Voltaire, you may recall, made the comment that he had destroyed the Bible. And he said, within 100 years, you'll have to go to a museum to see what a Bible looks like. I've destroyed the Bible. Well, interestingly enough, less than 100 years later, the Geneva Bible Society bought up his printing press, moved it into his home, which they bought, and started to print Bibles off his printing press in his home. I mean, that's the kind of sense of humor God has. Then there's Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, Jean-Jacques Rousseau was another philosopher who was not involved in a revolution, but who laid the philosophical underpinnings. He's the man who made popular the idea of the noble savage. He is the one who popularized the idea that civilized man is evil. Natural man, immoral, cannibalistic, sure, but they're pure. The noble savage. And he had 26 children that we know of. He didn't care for one of them. He abandoned them all to the poorhouse. Virtually every one of them died before reaching adulthood. And he felt nothing for them because he believed in the... here's the first one of this make love, not war mentality. His whole idea was all that matters is my personal feelings now, my experience. He is an existentialist in a real sense, not that they had the word back then. And so Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, undermined the morality and the family structure. In fact, he said the first priority is to destroy the family. The family is the enemy of the revolution. And Robespierre was the Lenin, the Vladimir Lenin, Stalin, Mugabe, Pol Pot, Fidel Castro of the revolution. Just what Robespierre, what Rousseau and Voltaire were to Marx, so is Robespierre to all the revolutionary leaders of our day and age in recent history. He was the one who implemented it. The tools of the French Revolution were disinformation, propaganda, the subversion of language to say what it never meant to say, malice, envy, hatred, jealousy, mass murder, and foreign military adventurism. The last being important as a diversion to distract the masses from the failure of government, because the government, or let's say the revolutionaries, will promise bread, jobs, land, peace, whatever the people want. I mean, they'd promise. Now, they'd never deliver these things. So to distract the people from why they couldn't deliver it, there's got to be war, continual war. And the war keeps people distracted because there's always an enemy. There's an enemy without, there's an enemy within, and there's the counter-revolution, and there's the reactionaries. And so you continually need to divert people from why things have failed. I think you perceive this in Zimbabwe, South Africa, and other places where revolutionaries can never achieve any of their promises. Now, these tools have been implemented by more modern revolutionaries like Vladimir Lenin, Trotsky, and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, Mao Zedong of Red China, Fidel Castro in Cuba, Che Guevara, Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, Nicolae Ceausescu, dictator, lovingly known as Dracula in Romania, Pol Pot of Cambodia, who killed about 40% of his population, Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam, and Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe, of course. The power-mad and the disenchanted have continued to sing the praises of the French Revolution and to attempt to replicate its ideals in revolutions as far afield as Russia, China, Cuba, North Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Ethiopia, Mozambique, Angola, the Congo, and Zimbabwe. Demonic forces and Enlightenment ideals of humanist philosophers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Voltaire prepared the ground for revolution. As Stalin once said, evolution leads to revolution. A very nice, catchy phrase which encapsulates a lot of details. Historian Otto Scott, who wrote one of the finest books on the French Revolution, Robespierre Inside the French Revolution, Otto Scott observed French intellectuals, middle and upper class, had grown ashamed of their country, of their history, and of their institutions. Such a phenomenon had never before arisen in any nation or race throughout the long history of mankind. A great loosening began. The country came slowly apart. So if you become ashamed of your country, and you become ashamed of your people, and you become ashamed of your race and your religion, your culture, then anything's possible. You're ripe for revolution when you no longer have an attachment to blood, soil, family, nation, race, culture. At that point, the revolutionaries can use you like Play-Doh in their hands. For the first time since the decadent days of Rome, pornography emerged from its caves and circulated openly in a civilized nation. The Catholic Church in France was intellectually gutted. The priests lost their faith along with the congregations. Of course, if the priests don't believe, that the congregations aren't going to believe much either, are they? Strange cults appeared. We're still quoting from Otto Scott. Sex rituals, black magic, Satanism, perversion became not only acceptable but fashionable. Homosexuals held public balls to which heterosexuals were invited, and the police guarded their carriages. This is the terminal stage of any culture, when they celebrate perversion openly. The air grew thick with plans to restructure and reconstruct all traditional French society and institutions, including marriage. Now, all this is a quote from Robespierre Inside the French Revolution by Otto Scott. The heirs of the Enlightenment of the late 18th century launched the first revolution in all of history against the ideas of Christianity and Christianity's God. That's what the French Revolution was first and foremost, a revolution against Christianity. The press was spearhead, font, and fuel for the revolution. You cannot have a revolution without the media being on side. The journals were mixtures of politics and smut. They admired agitators extravagantly, and they never discussed the church without mention of scandal. Everyone knows that all ministers are hypocrites, and you don't discuss the government without criticism, because it's, well, of course, if it's the government that you're not in yet, you criticize them. Once your people are in power, then any criticism of the government is treason. They relied heavily on tales of sin in high places, and high-handed outrages of the court. No name, however highly placed and illustrious, escaped. That included people in history that were highly respected. Through its journals and pamphlets, the press could distort, color, plead, argue, lie, report, misreport the information upon which the balance of the realm depended. I think you can begin to see why it's important to study the French Revolution. Because you've probably got a funny deja vu sense of, wait a minute, this is where we are now. This is the kind of thing that's going on in our day and age. We've seen this a few times. In fact, I've seen this quite a few times. I've lived through a few revolutions. Rhodesia and Zimbabwe, Southwest Africa and Namibia, South Africa into the ANC's New South Africa. We've seen how these revolutions work. And you can just see they've taken their script from the French Revolution. The most outrageous example of this media propaganda campaign was the malicious targeting of Queen Marie Antoinette. Although the princess was initially very popular, there were elder members of the court who deeply resented having an Austrian as heir to the throne and made her the target of outrageous smears, gossip, and slander. Marie Antoinette was generous with both friends and with the poor alike. The princess became a major patron of the arts and sponsored soup kitchens for the poor, innovated education for orphans, even adopted some unfortunates herself. Despite all this, her enemies circulated rumors that she was extravagant, immoral, plastered the walls with gold and diamonds. But the real reason for France's increasing financial woes was actually the enormous debt incurred by France during the 7 Years' War, when, as you can see, it looked like Russia, Sweden, Austria-Hungary, France, and Spain were arrayed against Prussia and Great Britain. And it was that ruinous 7 Years' War, and later the expense of assisting the North American colonies in the war against France's traditional rivals and enemy, Great Britain. But despite her enemies depicting her as frivolous and heartless, Marie Antoinette had many meaningful friendships. She is an avid reader of historic novels. She studied English, and she certainly never said, quote, a tribute to her. Most people know nothing about Marie Antoinette except that she is meant to have said, if they don't have any bread, why don't they eat cake? A nice little propaganda ditty, which there's no way that she could have said. All serious historians dismissed that as revolutionary propaganda, which was attributed to the Queen because, being an Austrian by nationality, she made a convenient target for the revolutionaries. The French involvement in the American War of Independence against Great Britain created an enormous debt for France. This debt added to the financial crisis which had already started with France's involvement in the early ruinous 7 Years' War against Great Britain and Prussia, which, although all forces from Russia, Sweden, Austria-Hungary, France and Spain failed to destroy Prussia and Great Britain, who were traditionally allies, and then to get back at them, because one of the results of this war is that the French lost Canada. And so to get back at Britain for taking Canada from them, they support the American colonists' war of independence. The colossal debt added to the financial crisis which propelled the French state into bankruptcy. Now, if you listen to the press, you'd swear Marie Antoinette was the personal responsibility of leading France into bankruptcy. It's her extravagance, it's her jewels, it's her parties. That's what's caused the financial crisis. Ignoring the most obvious thing, which is, well, France had been involved in two colossal international wars, which involved Canada and North America, and lost them just about every colony they had, whether in India or in the Americas, and it was a catastrophe. And that's why they're bankrupt, because they're fighting these ruinous wars. But it's so much easier to blame a foreign princess. King Louis XVI began his reign wisely. He dismissed the large number of corrupt, incompetent ministers inherited from the court of his father Louis XV. He appointed an excellent economist, Anne Robert Jacques Turgot, as Comptroller General, effectively Treasurer. Turgot proposed a drastic solution to France's crisis: cancel all tax privileges for the nobles. Up to then, nobles didn't have to pay any taxes, yet they could actually afford to. Abolish industrial monopolies, which of course is both inefficient and wasteful. Remove the restrictions on free enterprise, which is the most sensible thing to do if you want more taxes, and other bold practical solutions. However, the nobles pressured Louis XVI to dismiss Turgot. That was a disaster. Now, the king bravely tried some short-term measures to stave off the inevitable economic collapse, but when he attempted towards adopting Turgot's free and market strategies, the privileged nobles and the wealthy middle class forced the king to dismiss his next appointment too. The young banker Jacques Necker was given the task of managing this unmanageable bankrupt economy. And that was in 1781. Louis entrusted one hapless man after another with the financial crisis, but all to no avail. France's international credit rating was plummeting, the country was no longer able to secure loans, and it's bankruptcy that leads to revolutions. When you've got honest money and no inflation, you can't have a revolution. Revolutions happen in a time of breaking down the economy, which explains why the ANC and the revolutionaries behind them had to have economic sanctions on South Africa, had to work on everything to destabilize the rand, to keep tourists away, to undermine the economy, to break up work days, to have stayaways, to have boycotts, to have riots, anything to weaken the rand. And yet, interestingly enough, the rand was still only 2 rand to the dollar when Mandela became president. And he brought down to 14 rand to the dollar without a war, without sanctions, without riots, without conscription. And with foreign aid, he managed to collapse the economy. And yet somehow or another, people were making the apparent weakening of the rand in a time of war as a reason for having a change of government, effectively a revolution. So by mid-1788, the government had become paralyzed and was no longer able to avoid admitting bankruptcy. The king was now forced to reinstate Necker and call for a meeting of the Estates General to be convened in May 1789. The Estates General consisted of 3 houses. The first estate were the clergy, bishops and so on. The second estate were the nobles, dukes and counts and barons. The third estate were the merchants and the common people. Although the third house had twice as many people as the other houses, each house was understood to have only 1 vote. And this was to be a check and balance. Louis's government failed to specify how these 3 houses of the States General were to function, and they hadn't met for a very long time because Louis XIV had abolished them, and so this is generations that they hadn't had their equivalent of the Parliament, the States General meeting. He didn't provide them with any agenda, and they didn't even have a constitution to restrict their actions. That was foolish. The commoners in the third house now boldly organized themselves into a self-contained National Assembly, something that there was no constitutional provision for, but then they hadn't provided a constitution to prevent it either. The nobles were outraged and convinced Louis XVI to send troops to blockade the hall where the assembly planned to meet. Now, it's this kind of reactionary effort that just falls into the hands of revolutionaries. Because as Karl Marx said, you need thesis, antithesis, synthesis. What you want is synthesis, but you need to provoke the antithesis with your thesis, and their reaction enables you to get the synthesis with what you're after anyway. So you need the counter-revolutionary to react in a predictable way. And sending troops to blockade the hall of the National Assembly is not an intelligent solution. There's a whole lot better ways of doing it, and this just plays into their hands. The third estate then met in a nearby tennis court, made the tennis court oath, vowed to continue in session until they could complete a new constitution. That wasn't meant to be their purpose, but they weren't given a constitution to work with. There was no constitution to restrict them doing what they wanted. Therefore, they were able to just make themselves now into a constitutional assembly. This was outright rebellion against the authority of the king. Yet on the 27th of June 1789, Louis ordered the other 2 estates to join the commoners in this new combined assembly. This is appeasement, compromise of the worst kind. The National Assembly spent most of its time debating the latest philosophical and political theories, normally quoting Voltaire and Rousseau. Now, the Marquis de Lafayette, who had achieved fame through his involvement in the American War of Independence, espoused the cause of freedom and rallied the liberal wing of nobles around him. Not that I think any of them had the slightest idea what freedom meant. They certainly didn't have a biblical worldview to frame it, such as the colonists in North America could have had. These people were from a Catholic and a very humanist version of Catholic at that. The Count of Mirabeau dominated the assembly through his eloquent campaign calling for a constitutional monarchy, something like what Great Britain had. The most fanatical extremists gravitated to Maximilien Robespierre, who was a strong devotee of the writings of radical philosophers like Voltaire and Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau wrote, "It is necessary to have a cohesive force to organize and coordinate the movements of society's members." And so, interesting, he didn't want anyone telling him what to do. He was lawless his whole life. He didn't even feel a sense of responsibility to any of his own children. So Rousseau, though, believed that people must be controlled from the outside by a strong dominating force. Rousseau advocated constant agitation for equality in order to maintain an atmosphere of fear where individual differences will not be tolerated. And he said the key goal here is do away with the family. The family is the biggest enemy of the totalitarian state. Now, consider this. Agitate for equality in order to maintain an atmosphere of fear where individual differences won't be tolerated. Think transgenderism. Think gender mainstreaming. Think everything from the feminist movement through to the gay, GB, homosexual agenda, through to racial issues, Black Lives Matter, doesn't matter what the issue is, roads must fall, just continually agitate in the name of equality, but to maintain an atmosphere of fear where individual differences will not be tolerated. And the end result? The abolition of the family. And a situation of fear, we can manipulate a whole lot of people into whatever's going on. And you could see this with what's happened on University of Cape Town just a short while ago, where we had a young Christian girl who could be involved in a Roads Must Fall mob. The next thing she finds the same mob is against her because she made a social media comment that trying to legalize homosexual weddings and marriages is trying to normalize sin. And that comment, the same mob she'd been part of attacking the statues, now attacked her. And that's what goes on. It's an atmosphere of fear. Inspired by the defiance of the assembly, that the National Assembly, the third estate, could call itself a National Assembly and put itself effectively above the king and the laws of the land, and stirred up by revolutionary pamphlets and speeches, mobs now began to roam the streets of Paris, attacking and murdering even royal officials. This is a direct challenge to the state. France's financial house of cards now collapsed. I mean, who wants to invest in a country like this? Who wants to loan money to a country like this? Who wants to come as a tourist to a country like this? Who wants to trade with a country like this? Who wants to walk in the streets of a country where your safety is not even guaranteed? Capital fled the country. Economic depression resulted. You get the people to march for jobs. What will happen? There's less jobs. You attack the employers. What happens? They leave or close the factory, even more unemployment. It doesn't matter what the revolutionary mobs do, they make the situation worse, but that's the intention. They do want to make the situation worse. A series of events combine to create food shortages and hunger. Nothing gets people more panic-stricken than when they've got to spend hours every day just to find enough food to survive. Agitators panned out across the countryside to destroy the grain stores and terrorize the inhabitants. Can't have the farmers producing enough food to feed the people in cities. That'll make it too easy for them to survive. We want to create complete agitation. Hired mobs staged spontaneous riots in Paris. You might have heard of the Women's March. In fact, as this picture depicts, many of the women had beards, and it was plainly men dressed up as women who did this Women's March. I mean, it's as spontaneous and as female as a mob of men. The powers of government collapsed. Everything fell apart with astonishing coordination. In reaction, some of the nobles persuaded the king to seek to assert royal authority. This is, again, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Like, just take a hammer and a nail. The hammer's got to pull back in order to hit the nail with a forward motion. The pulling back is part of the motion of hammering in the nail. And so you might have them take 2 steps forward, 1 step back. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. The revolutionaries have a whole game for this. And the fools in government who don't understand how this works and have never read the agitation literature of Voltaire, Robespierre, Rousseau, Karl Marx, they don't understand that they fall into the trap again and again. So here, Louis XVI falls into another trap. He mobilizes his soldiers into the streets of Paris as a show of strength. The appearance of the soldiers now inspired the mobs to seize whatever weapons they could find and to storm the old fortress of the Bastille, which is an ancient fortress, a medieval fortress, obsolete by that time anyway, not particularly effective with the kind of weapons they had available at that time, but nevertheless, it was a symbol of the state's power. And so on the 14th of July, 1789, they stormed the Bastille, and that is where the French Revolution is officially dated from that point, 14 July 1789. The Bastille had become a symbol of hated tyranny, and a lot of legend has grown out of this event. As it so happens, there were no political prisoners at the Bastille at that time, so any talk of them rescuing and liberating political prisoners is complete fiction, but it makes a good story. Despite the fact that the Lieutenant Governor of the Bastille, M. de Launay, was guaranteed safe conduct, and he surrendered the fortress under a white flag of truce, the mob massacred the soldiers and massacred the governor, cut off their heads, and carried their heads on spikes throughout the streets. This on the 14th of July, which is celebrated in France and Franschhoek as Bastille Day. But then what do we celebrate on the 16th of June? Cooking and eating missionaries on the sidewalk of Soweto and Umtunzani in East London. That's what happened on the 16th of June, 1976. So-called Soweto Day, or Youth Day, which have now turned into a legendary, mythical, national, historical, kind of religious public holiday. Absolutely unrelated to reality, but they have these fictions that nations build their national heritage days on. As body parts of the defenders of the Bastille were paraded through the streets, a mere 7 criminals were found as prisoners in the Bastille, but no political prisoners. When this news reached the palace of Versailles, King Louis was astonished. "This is revolt," he said. The Duke de la Rochefort-Liancourt responded, "No, sire, it is revolution." The next day, King Louis bravely arrived, simply dressed and with no bodyguards or tents, and spoke at the National Assembly. He had ordered the troops to leave Paris. The people would have no reason to fear their king. Louis reassured them he had confidence in the assembly, and the deputies rose to feet, cheering with great fervor. Louis XVI was able to win them over, and this represented doubtless a setback for the revolutionaries. But they don't take these setbacks lying down. 88 of the deputies gathered at the Paris City Hall and took turns speaking to the enormous crowd from the balcony, and it seemed to be calming the mobs, and it seemed to be rolling back the tides of revolution. The famous 32-year-old Lafayette was elected General of the National Guard. Now, whilst many at this point seemed optimistic for the future, Marie Antoinette, who was doubtless the most intelligent person in the court, was filled with foreboding, and she burned her private papers. Nobles started to flee the court and fled across the country, and many settled across the border, recognizing this does not bode well and this isn't going to go well. On the 17th of July, the king traveled to Paris to identify with the revolutionary mob. In October, a mob marched to Versailles demanding that the king transfer his residence to Paris. And this is the so-called Women's March, which, as these pictures depict, highly unlikely that there were many women amongst this group of men in women's clothing. So the 6th of October, the royal family was escorted by the rioters to Paris, where they could be under the control of the revolutionaries. You see, Versailles was outside the city, and that was the palace of the monarch. Paris was where the people lived, and that's where they could control and intimidate the king. Otto Scott observed that Paris, like the nation, was divided into the politically active and the passive. Between the many confused, disorganized, and abstracted, and the highly concentrated and organized and intent few. That's the way it always works. It's never the majority who decides anything. It's small, dedicated minorities. Whether it's the 12 apostles handpicked by Christ in the upper room, or whether it's Karl Marx and his little group of about 12 Marxists who launched the Soviet Union Communist Party. It's little dedicated minorities who determine the fate of nations, whether good or evil. 2 clubs came to dominate the assembly. They didn't have the term of parties at that stage, and so they were called clubs. The Cordeliers were led by Georges-Jacques Danton and Jean-Paul Marat, 2 radical revolutionaries. But the most radical of all, the Jacobins, were skillfully manipulated by Maximilien Robespierre. It was in the French Revolution that the terms left-wing and right-wing were first coined. Those on the left were the radicals, who proudly adopted the designation left as a symbol of their revolutionary defiance of Christian tradition, because throughout the Bible it says, The fool's heart is on his left side. It says that God on the last day will say to the sheep on his right, enter into the joy of your Lord. Well done, good and faithful servant. And to the goats on his left, he'll say, depart from me, ye cursed, lake of fire prepared for the devil and his angels. And so in the Bible, the left are always the goats, the unregenerate, the anti-God, and on the right are the redeemed. And so that always represented those on the right hand of God as the saved, and those on the left as the damned. And so James Billington, in his Fire in the Minds of Men, The Origin of Revolutionary Faith, documents that the French Revolution self-consciously, as an anti-Christ, anti-Bible movement, chose to call themselves, we are the left. We are the damned. We were the goats. On the 4th of August, 1789, the nobles and the clergy renounced their privileges in the name of revolutionary equality. This isn't even 3 weeks after the Bastille has fallen. It's that quick. On the 2nd of November, the Assembly votes to issue paper money. Up till then, people paid in silver or gold coins. Now, paper money called assignats. And this sparked off rampant inflation, as you would expect. And that's the whole purpose of paper money. On the 2nd of November, the Assembly voted to confiscate church property. And so you see a beginning of the hijacking of the church, which in France, of course, was almost entirely Catholic, because all the Protestants had been persecuted into exile. The French Huguenots had fled about a century before. And so isn't it interesting that the country that rejected the Protestant faith now finds themselves victims of revolution? In July 1790, the Assembly nationalized the Roman Catholic Church by enacting the civil constitution of the clergy, which it didn't take long before the cardinals and bishops were hanging from the local signposts and being guillotined. The Assembly undertook to pay the salaries of the priests from the national treasury and to create a French church under the control of the government. You see, religion is essential. If you're going to control the people, you need to control the economics, you've got to control the faith, you've got to control the education. Pope Pius VI excommunicated all the clergymen who took a new oath demanded by the Assembly. I mean, imagine a minister having to take an oath of obedience to the state. The state is a minister of justice, and they have the sword, and the church a minister of grace, and they have the keys. Both are under God. You can't have the minister of grace being under the minister of justice, and you can't have the minister of justice being an arm of the church. The Catholic Church in the Middle Ages was controlling the state and having people burned at the stake for something like translating the Bible, having a Bible study. You don't want that. But you don't want the state controlling the church either, such as under a communist regime. They must be separate. Most of the clergy refused to take the oath and were evicted from the pulpits and parishes. And at this point, France was divided into 83 departments, or what we would call counties. The National Assembly now produced this famous Declaration of the Rights of Man and of Citizens, which, notice the style. It's in the tablets. It's in the similitude of the 10 Commands given by God on Mount Sinai to Moses and the children of Israel. And many people make a big thing about this declaration. The first Declaration of Rights of Man in the history of the world. No, that's absolute nonsense. The French Declaration of Rights of Man was patented after the English Bill of Rights of 1689 and after the American Bill of Rights, which had been appended to the United States Constitution. It wasn't the first Bill of Rights. And the French Declaration embodied mostly humanistic ideas of the Enlightenment. Unlike the English Bill of Rights, unlike the American Declaration of Independence and Bill of Rights, it didn't have a biblical worldview behind it. While attempting to adopt many of the forms of the biblically orientated Magna Carta of 1215 in England and the English Bill of Rights of 1689, the French Declaration of Rights of Man failed to recognize the Creator and ignored the biblical foundations for true freedom. You see, if the state gives you rights, the state can take those rights away. But if they are recognizing inalienable rights endowed by the Creator, well, that's a different matter. You can't abrogate or restrict an inalienable right. But if it's a state giving you a right, well, it can just easily take it away as they've given. The state is given, the state is taken away, blessed be the name of the state. And of course, they've got to destroy monuments, history. This is a vital part of every revolution, pulling down statues, pulling down representations, historic markers, monuments, anything that represents the old history, that gives people a marker of what happened. They've got to change everything. And so to destroy the old is vital. And the pulling down of statues is a revolutionary act. A new constitution was completed in 1791 with a unicameral, that's a single legislature, no checks and balances, no division of power, no upper and lower house. It's one chamber, a lawmaking body, which is elected by what they called active citizens, which is a very ill-defined term, which means, it's like if you speak to a communist, the people are the party. And if you're not part of the party, you're not one of the people. I mean, this is the first thing to understand. When they speak about the people, they're not talking about you. No, you're bourgeois, reactionary, fascist, colonial, lackey of the running dogs, racist, homophobic, bigot, Nazi, fascist, anti-Semite, Islamophobe, whatever. But the people are members of the party. And so when they say the people shall rule, they mean the party shall rule. Just like when a Muslim speaks about peace, he means submission to Sharia law. He's not meaning what you think about peace. He's meaning subjection. So before Mirabeau died in April 1791, he predicted that all the well-deliberated efforts at reform would collapse and would all be washed away in a bloodbath. Sadly, he was right. Louis XVI now started to see the writings on the wall, and wearing the tricolour cap and trying to pretend that he's one of the citizens didn't help one bit. And now he attempted to flee with his family from France on the night of 20 June 1791, a little late. When radicals discovered them, they blocked their path and escorted the royal family back to Paris. Doubtless they knew this was going to happen. Doubtless they let them go as far as almost the border for better effect. But they were probably never in any chance of succeeding, because instead of just disappearing into the forest and walking out of the country, they had to go in carriages. And so there's only so many roads and there's only so many carriages. How many people can afford a decent number of carriages? So this would have been extremely obvious, and it had no chance of success. And so the whole French Revolutionary Army now escorts them back to Paris in disgrace. Danton Robespierre now sees upon this opportunity as an opportunity to proclaim France is now a republic. Because in attempting to flee, the king has effectively abdicated. And so France is now a republic, which is what they wanted anyway. As the new Legislative Assembly met on the 1st of October 1791, the Girondists proposed replacing the just adopted constitution, creating a republic. By the way, that Bill of Rights didn't last a year. The so-called famous Declaration of Rights of Man. It's just a piece of nonsense. It's just a piece of paper that made a spectacular moment, a few minutes of fame, and for anyone to suggest that it's had any influence on anything in history, it was never even taken seriously. And now they've got a republic. Deeply concerned for the fate of the royal family, Austria, ruled by Leopold II, the brother of Marie Antoinette, now prepares to invade France to rescue his sister, who's obviously in mortal danger. The Assembly of France now declared war on Austria in 1792, but the French were soon defeated by the Austrians and Prussians, because a bunch of rabble who no longer want to follow the officers is not going to win a war, and they got absolutely slaughtered. And here you can see the attempts to try and restore some order to France. You've got Kingdom of Sardinia coming in from the south east, got Spain coming in from the south, Britain starting to blockade some of the fleets, and Prussia and Austrians coming in through Belgium, what we today call Belgium and Holland. So there's an attempt to try and restore some order to France. And of course then you have France having this massive revolutionary expansion where they conquer just about all their neighbors and go as far as Moscow. The mob stormed the king's residence and massacred the royal Swiss guards. Now, they were waiting for an excuse to do this. The excuse was, well, the brother of the queen has attempted to come to rescue her, so to prove that he had nothing to try and rescue her from, they stormed the residence, and her royal Swiss guards fought to the last man. They never surrendered. I mean, the Swiss have got a phenomenal reputation for tenacity and fighting. And the Swiss know French soldier attempted to protect the king and queen, but the Swiss guard fought to the last man to defend them, and they all died. And now, as the toppled statues of the king, the assembly voted to depose the king and write a new constitution. This now being the fourth constitution in less than 3 years. On the 10th of August 1792, the municipal government was overthrown and Danton became the self-appointed national dictator. In fact, tyrant would be more accurate because a dictator has been given power for a limited period of time by an authority. There was no such authority. Often we call a person a dictator who's actually a tyrant. A dictator would be someone like Pinochet of Chile, where he was, through legislation and referendums, given the power of a dictator for a limited period of time and handed it over when that time was up. Whereas Fidel Castro, as Castro's daughter has said, when she's been asked about her father being a dictator, she says, no, that's not the right word. He is not a dictator. I've checked it up in the dictionary. A dictator is someone elected for that purpose and given a limited amount of unlimited power for a limited period of time to resolve a problem. A tyrant is one who rules by force and terror without any authority. He says, my father, Fidel Castro, is a tyrant. And Danton was a tyrant, not a dictator. The entire male population was now to be drafted for military service, and weapons production entered high gear. They knew they could not fight against professional soldiers of the Austrians, the Prussians, the Spanish, Sardinians, the British, without total mobilization. So the entire population now mobilized for war. This is also something interesting, that a revolutionary promises peace. And the moment they get to power, they have universal conscription and they start to organize lots of wars. Then in September 1792, terrorist mobs swarmed throughout the prisons and massacred thousands of prisoners, including many nobles, thousands of nobles who had been arrested for no other reason than that they were nobles, barons, dukes, and princesses. And there was terrible massacres, cruelty, butchery, savagery of the mobs, just attacking people for absolutely no reason, including killing princesses in the street. A new national convention was called on the 21st of September 1792 to write a new constitution. In December 1792, the convention summoned the deposed king, Louis Capet, as he's now called. And on 21st of January 1793, King Louis XVI was beheaded on the guillotine. All of Europe was horrified, and a coalition was formed against France, because this revolution is not going to stay there, it's going to keep spreading to other countries too. Austria, England, Holland, Prussia, Spain, Piedmont prepared to restore order to France. Now the Jacobins mobilized the mob to invade the convention and arrest the 31 leading Girondists, who was the group that was running the country at that stage. And this launched the official Reign of Terror, which officially began 2nd of June 1793. Robespierre established the Committee of Public Safety. You know, it's amazing. If you look at the terms for KGB, Department of Homeland Security, and then they've got the terrorist activities of Cuba, Ministry of Internal Affairs. Always have these innocuous names for hideous organizations. Committee of Public Safety. What do? They organize a policy of mass public terror with revolutionary tribunals in which all enemies of the revolution were summarily tried without innocence or proven guilty, guilty until proven innocent. You've got no chance to prove you're innocent anyway. A mere accusation was tantamount to a verdict of guilt. Trials were abrupt, with no real opportunity granted the accused to prepare or present any defense. And if you've read A Tale of Two Cities, you've got an idea of how this goes. And anyone, for any reason, could end up in the wagon being dragged off to the guillotine. The accused were quickly convicted and carted off to the guillotine, often just a matter of hours from a accusation to death and execution. The Queen, the 37-year-old Marie Antoinette, was now dragged to the mockery of a trial on the 16th of October 1793 and guillotined the very next day. She was tried by the Revolutionary Tribunal and remained composed in the face of outrageous accusations and abuse, and this is after having been kept without food in cold, dungeon-like conditions, and conditions where she is guaranteed to get sick, and to try and make her debilitated and without the opportunity to wash and care for herself. And yet she still managed to have a composure in front of her enemies. She declared a clear conscience, her Christian faith, and her love for her children, who they had taken away from her. Within a day, her hair was cut short and she was driven through Paris in open cart wearing a simple white dress. Why did they have to cut her hair? At 12:15, at the age of 37, she's executed at the place, the Revolution, today the place of the Concorde. She is courageous to the very last, and you could just see why the revolutionaries hated her. She is more intelligent than the king. She is the real enemy of the revolution. She is a danger, because if they'd listened to her, the revolution would not have succeeded. Her son, who'd been taken away from her, Louis, he is recognized as Louis XVII, which is why the next king of France after Louis XVI was Louis XVIII, because they acknowledged that this martyred son, he died of inhumane treatment by revolutionary jailers, and how they mistreated him was so wicked and evil. They took him away from his mother and kept him amongst blaspheming occult Satanist pagans until he blasphemed Christ. Then they let him die of starvation. And then they let his mother know, we got him to blaspheme Christ, renounce his faith, so that he won't be in heaven with you. I mean, think of the mentality of that kind of scum. In 1815, during the Restoration, both her body and that of Louis XVI were exhumed and received a decent Christian burial in the necropolis of the French royalty at the Basilica of St. Denis. Few women have ever had to endure such a total reversal of fortunes, being born at the very apex of power and privilege in Vienna, at the capital of Europe at that stage, dying at the hands of a brutal Marxist mob during the French Revolution. Marie Antoinette was a victim of circumstance completely outside of her control, yet she faced her fate with Christian courage and conviction. And to think that she is attacked in these days, interestingly enough, some time ago, Christopher at school was required to do a project on Marie Antoinette, discussed it with us, and he came out with a very positive one. Apparently he's the only one in his class of a Christian school that was pro Marie Antoinette. The others were all, she deserved it because she said this horrible thing. How could she say, let them eat cake? And there was this prejudice being pushed in the school, even a Christian school, against Marie Antoinette. That's just not fair. But this is how the left tried to not just kill people, but kill their souls and kill our conscience. And this is what the revolution was. Heads rolled. 21 Girondist leaders, including Madame Roland, one of the worst of them, were also beheaded shortly after the Queen. This is an interesting thing about revolutions. Revolutions are cannibalistic. They soon eat up their own. The Duke of Orleans, who had joined the Jacobins and taken the name of citizen egalitaire, even voted for the death of his own cousin, the king. He was also executed at this time. So his treachery didn't do him any good. And so many of the revolutionaries who had sent others to the guillotine ended up on it themselves. Romantic occultism taught a Big Bang theory of social science. If you can blow up or burn down enough buildings and kill enough people, you can produce utopia. And we still have people with that mentality today. And this is the Malemas and the Mugabes of this world. Blow up enough things and paradise will come out of it. Mr. Scarborough and I heard that apostate, coloured Reformed minister, Alan Bussack, saying, out of the ashes of Pretoria will arise the New Jerusalem. Now that's the mentality of the liberation theology. Out of the ashes of civilization will arise the New Jerusalem. That's the mentality. The reign of terror spread throughout France. When one city sought to resist, they destroyed it. The revolutionaries set up a pillar outside Lyon, described Lyon waged war with liberty. Lyon is no more. That's what liberty, equality, and fraternity means. Toulon was subjugated under the leadership of a young artillery officer from Corsica, Napoleon Bonaparte, who the world would hear a lot more about later. As he said, I did not steal the crown. I found it lying in the gutter and picked it up at the point of my sword. The Committee of Public Safety now launched a vicious atheistic war against Christianity, against marriage, against the clergy, here guillotining nuns. They invented a new religion which they called the Cult of Reason. At a festival at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, an actress, that's using a nice word, was enthroned as the goddess of the French people, and France was renamed the Republic of Virtue. Now, where they get virtue from, I have no idea, because it's not part of their revolution. Ancient Rome was now lifted up as the model. The press and the theatres were turned into instruments for state propaganda. Fashions changed to immoral, loose Roman-type garments. Over 2,000 churches were renamed temples of reason and hijacked for the promotion of their cult. Historian Arnold Toynbee wrote, "In the Revolution, a sinister ancient religion suddenly erupted with elemental, meaning primitive, violence, the fanatical worship of collective human power." And this was the bizarre result of this atheistic, anti-Christ, anti-God religion that ended up launching a cult of human reason, with public idols, bowing and scraping and offerings and candles and incense and sacrifices. In fact, you can say that the guillotine was the human sacrifice required, the blood sacrifice. You can even see the incense on the way up and all this, almost resembling a Tower of Babel concept. This was the religion of Robespierre and the Reign of Terror. The terror was only the first of the mass crimes that are being committed in this evil religion's name. That's from John Wilson, The Gods of Revolution, speaking about how the communist revolutions of this day are the direct descendants of the French Revolution. And that's what Karl Marx says too. That's what Lenin said. That's what all of the communist leaders through to our day, Castro, Mugabe, they all say the French Revolution, that was the first. That was the beginning. Karl Marx looked at them and said they were the first true communists. But his friend Engels said, no, the first real communists were the Peasants' Revolt and the Baptists. They were the first real communists. Interestingly. On the 7th of May, Robespierre sought to impose a new religion on France, declaring a new calendar to replace the Christian calendar. 21 September 1792, the day the monarchy ended, was now declared the first day of year one of the revolutionary calendar. And they tried a 10-day work week, which, needless to say, failed. Robespierre appointed himself as the high priest of the supreme being in this new cult. This is the thing that's so bizarre. Like the Stalins of this world. We're against religion. Next thing, you've all got to worship me. It's from idolatry, it goes to be idolatry. Anthropology, first you worship man as God, and before you know it, you worship the party as God, and in time you come to worship the party leader as God. The revolutionaries began to turn on one another. Danton, one of the top revolutionaries who'd sent more people to the guillotine than anyone else, he is executed the 5th of April, 1792. And then Marat, his number 2, was assassinated by Charlotte Corday, a Godondist sympathizer, while taking a medicinal bath for his debilitating skin condition. Marat was stabbed by Charlotte Corday, a 24-year-old. In his death, Marat became an icon to the Jacobins as a revolutionary martyr. Charlotte Corday, the angel of assassination as they called her, she declared at trial, "I knew that he, Marat, was perverting France. I have killed one man to save 100,000. She referred to Marat as a hoarder and a monster who was respected only in Paris. On the 17th of July, 1793, just 4 days after Marat was killed, Charlotte was executed by the guillotine, aged 24. 4 days between crime, trial, and execution. 24-year-old. They killed thousands. Well, in fact, they killed tens of thousands, and as she said, if he had his way, hundreds of thousands more would have died. So Charlotte's just one of the people who started to fight back. On the 27th of July, 1794, Robespierre and 20 other of his henchmen were seized and executed by the survivors of the convention. So the 27th of July, interestingly, was Charlotte's birthday. And that is just, where are we? I need to go back a bit. She managed to kill him on the 13th of July, and on the 27th of July, her birthday, the Reign of Terror came to an end, as Robespierre and his 20 top henchmen were seized and executed by the survivors of the convention. So Charlotte's resistance to Marat led to Robespierre and the rest of his gang being beheaded by the very people who they had been terrorizing for so long. And this is how reigns of terror go. Robespierre, who led the assembly for so many years, in the end shot in the face by one of his own people, dragged from the assembly. He is still basically alive, even though he couldn't talk because his jaw had been broken by a bullet. And they forced him into the same guillotine where he had forced so many others. This is the death of Robespierre, officially the end of the reign of terror. More than 40,000 victims had been murdered under the guillotine under the reign of terror by that time, by the time Robespierre died. 300,000 others had been murdered by firing squads or by drownings. Over 2/3 of those victims had been peasants, artisans like carpenters and artists and workers. You need to know this because there are people who say that they were executing the nobles. But as you see in the Tale of Two Cities, there's a seamstress on this wagon heading out to the guillotine. She says, "What have I done? How is my death going to help the revolution? If it would help, I wouldn't complain, but what is the reason?" And they're trying to work through the logic of how the people get condemned in this insane mob violence that carries on in a revolution. And that's the point. In the name of the people suffer. In the name of justice, injustice is done. As Madame Roland was being ushered up the platform to be guillotined, and she'd been one of the biggest cheerleaders of how many guillotinings before that, including of the king and queen, she faced the statue of the goddess Liberty and she cried out, "O Liberty, Liberty, what crimes are committed in thy name?" She should know. She was reaping what she had sowed. The end of the reign of terror was not the end of the French Revolution, though. It would be followed by a directory of 3, and then by the dictatorship, which eventually culminated in Napoleon's empire of 1799, which then embroiled all of Europe in a ruinous war. Even after the death of Robespierre, the revolution continued to talk about liberty and equality. And fraternity, I presume. They continued to fight against the Christian faith and to inspire more communes, more voices of virtue, more Vladimir Lenins, Joseph Stalins, Fidel Castro's, and Mao Zedong's. The French Revolution was the prototype, which was followed by the Bolshevik Revolution, which we often wrongly call the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, the Cambodian Revolution, the Vietnamese Revolution, the Ethiopian Revolution, the Mozambican Revolution, the Angolan Revolution, the Zimbabwean Revolution, and many others. In every case, they proved that yesterday's revolutionaries become tomorrow's tyrants and dictators. In fact, in every single case, and I defy anybody to find one exception, the revolutionaries always prove to be worse than what they've overthrown. In some cases, 100 or 1,000 times worse. This is Zimbabwe. It used to be the main road. You won't see the road looking this good now, but this is just 2 years after liberation. Christians on a prayer march being whipped on the streets with their faces in the pavement with the boots on their necks of the police, dressed in helmets and carrying assault rifles and battle gear. Women outside a government building in Harare being beaten for having a prayer meeting outside the government building. The French Revolution, because nothing embodies liberty, equality, and fraternity like the mass murder of tens of thousands of people, arbitrary legal rulings, and aggressive wars of conquest against your neighbors. And yet, incredibly, even though I was in a Catholic school in Rhodesia, they taught us the French Revolution like it was one of the greatest things in history, which brought democracy, freedom, human rights, so many wonderful things. And that's what we were taught, with no ifs, ands, and buts, and most of the details I've given here were not in there. And you wonder, why would a Catholic school teach you that the French Revolution was good when so many Catholics died at the hands of the French Revolution? 2 Peter 2:19, while they promise them liberty, they themselves are slaves of corruption, slaves of depravity. You could write that over just about every single revolution out there. So, we've been teaching about the French Revolution for some time. The best book on the French Revolution, without any ifs, ands, and buts in my mind is Otto Scott's Robespierre, The Fool is Revolutionary Inside the French Revolution. This is incredible. I think I read this book in under 6 days. It was gripping. I thought, this is unbelievable. I've lived through this in Rhodesia. I've lived through this in South Africa. I've seen these tragedies. There's nothing new under the sun. These Marxists of today are using exactly the same tactics, using exactly the same arguments, and expecting exactly the same reactionary, counter-revolutionary activities that they can give their thesis, antithesis, synthesis. No, Otto Scott has really understood the revolution, and Robespierre is the prototype. Charles Dickens, living a generation afterwards, captured its soul brilliantly in A Tale of Two Cities. So while the best history book on the French Revolution would be Robespierre, the best novel would be A Tale of Two Cities. In fact, A Tale of Two Cities, which is a tale of London and Paris. London, a city that was affected by the revivals of the great evangelical awakening that came out of the ministry of Whitefield and Wesley, and Paris, a city of secular humanist revolution that experienced the fruit of the preaching of Rousseau and Voltaire. And that's the difference. And this is why when Francois Mitterrand was president of France and he visited Britain, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher gave a leather-bound copy of Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities to Francois Mitterrand. I think that's such a brilliant, appropriate, intelligent gift to give to a French premier. A Tale of Two Cities. Maybe he could understand something about why we don't celebrate the French Revolution. Because the French Revolution is Antichrist. And the difference between two cities, the difference between the great evangelical revival in England and secular humanist revolutionary enlightenment in France, the fruit. And that's why today, what do we have a choice of? Well, it's Reformation or revolution in many cases. The best of the films that's true to it, that even includes the scripture, is A Tale of Two Cities, the 1930s version, absolutely tremendous. Ronald Coleman's version. We've got this on our library, and many of the modern Tale of Two Cities gut it of all content. They just take out everything that made the book so great. This one is true to the book. It's Christian. It includes preaching, it includes prayer, it includes scripture, it includes at the very, very end. The last frame is Jesus said, "I'm the resurrection and life. He who dies and believes in me will rise again." Just a wonderful conclusion there. And, you know, of course, the well-known phrases. How does the book begin? It was an age of reason. It was an age of foolishness. And it ends up, a far better thing I do now than I've ever done. A far greater rest I go to than I've ever known. I mean, some of the best known words in English literature. And it's grown out of this hideous experience of the French Revolution. Well, if you want an uplifting, intelligent cultural film, Tale of Two Cities is it. And just a picture of George Whitefield. His preaching and God's blessings on his open-air preaching in the 1730s, 1740s, 1750s prevented revolutionary secular humanism from getting its grips on the British Isles and North America. But for that, the same kind of revolution that tore France apart could have torn Britain and North America.